TV sports network ESPN did one of these silly time killer promotional contests called Who's Now. How many of you watch ESPN? You know what I'm talking about, this Who's Now contest. And this contest pitted athletes from different sports against one another. They're competing against one another, but they weren't actually competing. Their reputations were competing against each other. It was all about a combination of who's good on the field and who's popular, who's got that buzz off the field, who's got the endorsements, who's got the reputation. And so no offensive lineman in football, no matter how good of an athlete, is ever going to win an award like this. The Who's Now winner ended up to be, any of you know? Tiger Woods, that's right. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because if there's anyone who's at the top of his game right now in all respects, it's Tiger. Tiger Woods is so good all the time that there's no golfer who thinks he can beat him on a consistent basis. Maybe once, maybe twice, but for someone to overtake Tiger and consistently beat him, no one thinks they can do that. For Tiger Woods, life these days is very, very good. The psalm we are looking at today is a song of thanksgiving, written by the Tiger Woods of his day, King David. Things were going very well for David when he wrote this psalm. David was the top dog. David was, a bad fool. The first bit of text which opens this psalm tells us that David wrote it, but that it was used years later when the temple was dedicated. Let me just read it again to you. It says, a song for the dedication of the temple of David. Now the problem is, David wasn't around when the temple was dedicated. His son Solomon built the temple. And even though Solomon's not named here, I think it's likely that Solomon chose this psalm to express how he felt at that point in his life. And when Solomon was about to dedicate the temple, he was the Tiger Woods of his day. He was at the top of his game. Life was very good for Solomon. What his father David had accomplished, Solomon had surpassed. Under Solomon's rule, Israel's borders were at their furthest extent, from the north to the south, from the east to the west. Israel, to this day, has never been any larger than it was during Solomon's day. And finally, after years of planning, delays, and of course, escalating construction costs, the temple finally was built. It was kind of like that big dig project in Boston. It just kept being delayed and delayed and delayed, and money spent, and finally, it's ready to be dedicated. And at that point in time, Israel as a nation had finally arrived. Politically and militarily, she had no peer. And now with the temple in place, she would no longer be mocked among the nations as that country whose God lives in a tent. You remember, they had this tent they would put up, and they lived with this for years and years and years. Finally, they could be like the other nations. And so life was very good for Solomon and for his nation. But instead of making a speech proclaiming Israel's arrival, instead of being pompous and proud at that point, what he did was he looked backwards and he gave thanks to God, using the psalm of his father David for bringing the nation up to that point in history. This psalm of thanksgiving functions as a model for you and I to think in a right way, in a good way, in a healthy way, during those times in our lives when life is good, when things are going well. When life is good, aren't we all tempted to let down our guard a bit? Aren't we all tempted when life is good to take life for granted? As if, of course, this is the way it's supposed to be. And it is. And maybe just a little bit. It's going well because I made it go well. It's going well because I deserve it to go well. I'm a good guy. I've not done too many wrong things, and so I deserve all this. Living in Zimbabwe from 1999 to last year, we had a wonderful time, and we ran into people who had occasionally, not by and large, but occasionally, we'd run into people, white Zimbabweans, who'd been white Rhodesians when the country was ruled by white minority rule, when it was a British colony and then afterwards, who we just kind of brushed up against them, and it was clear that they didn't have that sense of being thankful for what God had given them. They looked upon their position, and they saw it eroding away when things started to change in the country. They looked upon their position as something they earned and deserved, and were just panicking. But by and large, most people that we ran into, most people that we hang out with, looked at things in a different way. They looked at things like, okay, well, things are going badly. How can we look to God? How can we thank God even in the midst of trouble? But even in the midst of that, you had that occasional person we run into who would just have an attitude like, man, we don't deserve this, or we want things back to the way they were when we ruled the land. David and Solomon, David when he wrote the psalm and Solomon when he used it, were under no illusions that they deserved the good things they had. I'd encourage you to dip into 1 Kings this week. 1 Kings around chapter 8. You read this whole section of the dedication of the temple, and the language is so vivid. You can almost see the sights and smell the smells and hear the sounds. And at that time, Solomon